All right, John, thank you for coming in.
Good to be here again.
We want to start, I think, with the issue of development, which is the sort of overriding community issue of concern, it would appear, and ask you to kind of spell out your own approach to the development cap, the need for more housing. Just give us an overview of sort of how you would approach development in the city.
I think this is sort of where I began in the last election when I was running in 2014. I thought a moratorium and a cap were totally necessary immediately to slow down the momentum. So I'm very much of the opinion that we have to do something to hit these moving targets, which are rolling forward so fast that by the time they got to discussing a cap, there was so many things in the works that you don't see much slowdown. And that's why I think people have a feeling of inactivity on the part of the political machinery, because they see things continuing to move forward without adjustments as the streets are blocked, traffic piles up, and things like that. So I believe that the way to do it, and in the last election I wanted a moratorium in this part of town so that no further building took place on on El Camino, and in the train corridor, because I see that intersection over there and Embarcadero as the two worst choke points in the traffic pattern. But I don't think you get a handle on the other quality of life issues, such as parking, traffic, the cost of city services, unless you get a handle on the development. And by that I mean the square feet of build out, the number of workers that amount of square footage can entertain, which is a little generous, overly generous, I think, now with the new workplace to begin with. So my feeling is that the scrutiny that the Planning Commission, Planning Department, City Manager, and Council needed to devote to all new development is of the highest order, strict scrutiny of all new projects. And I haven't seen that. I've seen sort of backing into it. I think the cap was low, and the excluding the Stanford Industrial Park from it is problematic, will be more problematic. And what's going on downtown just seems entirely too intense, especially when you look at the encroachment on the roadways and the time it takes to build some of these projects. The one across from City Hall took a long time, 600 Ramona, 600 Cowper, now 600 Waverly. All of those are right up on that part of town that I first lived in when I got out of Stanford in '68. I lived over on Scott Street. And that's where a really strong initiative was put forward to don't do the hospital because of the impacts that it would have if they built the hospital on the old clinic land there. They would have just blown that whole neighborhood all the way into Professorville. And so that's why it was stopped. And same with the superblock downtown. Well, I think the cumulative impacts of some of those projects, like 600 Ramona, 600 Waverly, 600 Cowper, the place they wanted to build over on Lytton by the 7-Eleven there, the Gateway Project, 101 Alma or whatever that was. All of those, you add them together, and they're the equivalent of a superblock or a hospital or something like that, if you added all the stuff in the pipeline. So that's the type of scrutiny I think the council could step up and say, this is a quality of life issue. We are going to put a stop on it now. We need further discussion. We want a water use profile, things like that, especially if you're going to put a basement, garage parking, whatever that kind of thing is. And use the tools of government that are there to get some action on the slowdown, which is, I think, the number one priority.
So what you're describing there is the lag time of the pipeline projects. So the appearance is that nothing has changed.
That's right.
Even though we in fact have clamped down with this development cap.
Yes, there has been incremental change, but it isn't enough to have people feel that a process is in play that is going to give them relief on things like residential parking and on the thing. A lot of older residents plan their day around avoiding the worst times of the day. But when they go out and they get stuck and they can't even move, or they come in on, if they've never come in on Page Mill on the Oregon Expressway during peak hours and taken the 15, 20 minutes it takes to get from 101 to El Camino, they're a little shocked. And then they understand, well, wait a minute, I see what my neighbor was talking about who goes to work every day. Or people that live on University Avenue or Hamilton, that it takes them 20 minutes to get to the bridge over there.
Right. So with regards to the development cap, are you in support of keeping that tight a restriction just sort of going forward? Right now, of course.
Yes, I'm sort of. I'm pretty much on a status quo level. On below market rate housing, is it 20% now? I believe that. Let's keep it. Let's work from where we're at. I mean, I don't see that it's practical to. You would create such a hubbub and so much discomfort with so many people. But I think we work from where we're at. But yes, I would like the cap strengthened. And I said I think they gave a big out for the Stanford Industrial Park. And I think with the housing Stanford's anticipating building in Escondido Village, we're going to have some serious discussions about not only traffic here in town and in and out, but their whole traffic management requirements for the mitigations for when the hospital opens and stuff like that.
So just to be clear, the 50,000 per year cap is something you'd want to put in place on a semi-permanent basis, or would you
maybe larger? But to begin with, I would say we got to work with
larger. You mean smaller?
Smaller. I mean larger. A larger emphasis by the city to regulate growth, monitor cumulative impacts, take into water, energy, city services. I mean, this is a town that doubles in size every day. We all know that. And in many of these places, I don't think their tax rates equal the amount of benefits they get from the community.
And how do you feel about the efforts being made on the transportation management side of things? Are you believing that is going to be enough to have
I don't think it's going to be
positive impact?
It's going to have a positive impact. I don't think it's going to be enough.
And what additional steps would you
if I see the Visa building going up over there, and then they're going to remodel over here at Olive Garden and stuff like that, we're going to need some sort of structure in this part of town. I'm a little concerned about the capital expenditures overall. 10 years ago, the city budget was under 300 million. Now it's over 600 million. I mean, those and then you add capital works, public works, like parking structure or something like that. You've got some serious fiscal management issues, I think, with solving the parking problem. But yeah, I think this part of town is going to need some parking. And
well, we were talking about TMA, though.
TMA, and that's
you're looking for a California Avenue area TMA specifically.
Yeah,
is that
probably? But what I don't understand is they put out the stop sign over there when the AOL figures came in, and the traffic study did not jive with just people's general understanding of what was going on in the area. So they said, wait a minute, time out. I think more parking is needed in this part of town. I think when the Visa is that what it's called? When the new big building over there by Sheridan, when that one gets built, I think we're going to see.
It's built, it's just not finished.
I see that. Yeah, I was surprised. They had the Finnish guys out there today when I drove by. Yes, I think there's going to be a need for more parking in this part of town, and I think I don't think traffic management, and I don't think an assessment district. I don't think any one tool that we've used before will cover it. I think we're going to need to do all of the above to deal with the parking in this area. And I think it's important. I mean, I don't like the idea of this second downtown, but I do like the idea of spreading the burden of the type of business community we need to build to be viable between here and the University Avenue, the downtown area. I think that's a good strategy.
Some would go even further on the cap and not have a cap, but just have a moratorium on all of office growth. I
would support that over a cap, short term, but not a Santa Barbara 10, 15 year type of thing. I would like to see action. And if I were elected, I would be willing to start with a moratorium and say, let's put it all out on the table here and see what we need to do. Let's do some problem solving and get the business community, the people that are buying these new buildings. I think we are going to have a change in the banking climate. I think the interest rates will go up eventually. There will be normalization. It will cost more to build a building that you have to amortize over 30 years and things like that. So, but I'd be willing to, yes, support a moratorium first day, yeah.
On the issue of housing, what's your thought on micro units or high density housing? Do you see that as a solution to anything?
I see that as very helpful, but yeah, I would never approve of one over on the corner there, the worst intersection in town. I mean, it's a parking lot now. I'd double the size of the parking lot before I'd put 45 units of, 45 new parking spaces with an attractive nuisance. In other words, each unit could have 2 cars. I don't think they can regulate a lot of that stuff, is what I'm saying. I think those are very hard to enforce provisions. But on the idea of lot consolidation and higher density in brown sections, like the Fry's over there and planned. It was funny, when the place came down, the old antique shop downtown on Addison and Alma, they talked about changing the zoning and this, and they didn't even talk about housing. There's 4 lots there. They could put, there's a lot they could have consolidated and built some housing. Nobody wants to build the more than 5 units though, because they have to do a BMR unit. That's why you see, I think, 2 and 3 units in these places, is they get, once they start doing multiples, they have to put one in there that would create hardship, right? We heard that down at Mayville there, hardship. 16 luxury homes is hardship if the guy has.
So the micro unit high density concept, of course, is that it reduces the price of the individual unit,
Yeah.
makes for more affordable units. You see this happening in some other communities. Do you reject that basic premise?
Oh no, I support that, but it has to be in the right place. And I do think that's an area in which federal funding could be made available under a Democratic administration with some Democratic help in the Senate and that kind of thing. I think the way in which federal housing programs were gutted in the 80s, what did it go from 250 billion to 50 million or something? I mean, I don't have the figures at the top of my head anymore, but the way in which job training and housing was collapsed in the Reagan administration has never been fixed, in terms of most of the tax expenditures that have gone to housing have gone to tax relief for homeowners and things like that, not building. And the below market rate program worked very well, I thought. And thanks for printing that letter, by the way, when I complained about because I noticed the part that got cut out, though, was the Lou Goldsmith, Sylvia Siemens thing. But there used to be a different way of approaching the issue of housing here in town. I wouldn't call it necessarily noblesse oblige, but there were people that realized we want more teachers, firemen, policemen here living in town, role models in the community, active in the environment. But the stretch to get them in wasn't what it is today, given the market costs. And so as a former teacher who saw it gone when I was there, as all the older teachers retired, the new teachers that came in, none of them could afford to live in the community. So by the time I left in 2010, there were 150 certificated staff there about, and less than a dozen lived in Palo Alto. And when they don't live in Palo Alto, they're more hurried to get home. If you don't get on the freeway by that, 3:30 window, an extra half hour maybe if you're driving to Gilroy and that kind of thing. And so it really is, it changes the tone and the climate of the community, not just the learning communities at the schools, but the fact that these people aren't active in town, coaching soccer and stuff like that.
So if we're going to encourage developers to build housing, what part of this housing spectrum would you focus on, and how would you go about incentivizing that particular type of housing?
Well, in the past I thought, and that's why that form code thing and the governance thing at the end where they say in the governance element of the comprehensive plan, they say ways to make more clear the distinctions of what zoning requirements are for particular parcels, et cetera, and so on. I think in regard to accessory dwelling units, that's very doable. As I said in the last election, I think you can have lots on corners. A long lot that has a garage on the back of it is perfectly suited to converting the garage to a studio or something. If necessary, if the person wanted to subdivide to do that, I would encourage people though to have rental units or something like that. But a carport instead of a garage required. How many square feet? What type of utilities? I know this idea of getting rid of gas hookups, I think that's a bit premature. I think gas remains a transition fuel until we solve the fossil fuel problem, but I think the city can lead the way in some of those areas for accessory dwelling units. I also feel that lot consolidation, once you put, I haven't looked at it, but I know it was happening just as the last election ended. The project they built behind the old compadres there on Wilton or whatever street that is, that's a consolidated lot, and I imagine it's got enough units that it has to have at least one BMR unit in it. So those types of things, if you're putting 6 townhouses or something down, the developer should be, can't buy his way out, his or her way out of it, has to build that below market rate unit. And I think once we start to make some progress in it, it can be seen, especially if there's an enabling attitude in the planning department, how more of that can be done. I think most of the enabling attitude has been towards big buildings, like those ones I mentioned earlier. And that I think when the city got everything geared up to deal with homeowner, kitchen, bathroom remodeling in general, it improved the capacity of things to sail through the planning department at a quicker rate. And the economy sort of, I think, with the Fed rate and everything that's been done since the liquidity crisis of 2008, 2009, has also encouraged a lot of these forces that have been at work in the community without the mitigations needed to deal with traffic, utilities, staffing at City Hall, and things like that. So I think that explains part, I think, of the mushrooming budget and how we doubled the budget in a little more than a decade. That's a concern to me, because when times are tough, then there's more pain. That's what I've liked about the way Jerry Brown's managed the state budget. He said, let's put this money aside, let's not do this. And I don't think that attitude got much legs at City Hall.
Good.
On the issue of ADUs, since you brought them up.
Which one?
Accessory dwelling units.
Yes.
Yeah, so some of the other candidates are concerned that there's not enough enforcement power in the city to make sure that ADUs, if there were more of them, wouldn't just be used for, say, Airbnb or the kind of undesirable rentals where people are just coming and going, and it creates traffic problems and parking problems. What strategies do you have?
Well, I think that's totally, you can legislate that. You can legislate taxes on hotel rents. You can legislate, not fees, you can't call them taxes, I think. You can, in every way, I would think, imaginable, especially in terms of, once again, getting to form code and doing things with environmental compliance and things like that. There are all sorts of enforcement powers that the city government has under the general city's capacity. I mean, they can do all sorts of things to regulate this. It just takes the will, to do it. And I think that's easily done with things like lease minimums, 1-year minimum lease, no subletting, that type of thing. I don't see how you could rent a room out if you're doing that kind of thing, and that should be part of the permitting process that I say the planning department should have to enable the creation of accessory dwelling units. I lived in a garage in East Palo Alto my senior year at Stanford and paid $10 a month rent, but it was only possible because my friends lived in the basement apartment, and that was the bathroom and kitchen I used. There was no bathroom and kitchen in that garage. But there was, and I could also use the one in the main house. So basically, I had access, guest privileges at 2 other areas. But and I lived in a garage downtown for a while too. And I lived in houses that were tear downs. Most of the time I lived on the north side. I lived in the shadow of the D8 bulldozer, and in fact was the subject of eviction a number of times too, because the speed with which the project was going forward was quicker than I could find relocation. And that's what happened with Webster Wood there when I was living there.
So to pivot a little bit here, Airbnb rentals in this community are, we don't know the exact number, but they're substantial.
Yeah.
The council has up until now opted to punt on any kind of regulation. What's your approach to that? Do you think some sort of permitting and regulatory scheme is necessary to address some of the impacts that people are identifying?
I would support that. I don't have the data on that. I know it's a problem. It's a problem from what I hear, and it's also a problem, I think, from people that I know are doing it, that say, I'm doing this, and this is the frequency, and you ask them, well, what do your neighbors think of that? That kind of thing, and you see, well, I'm not sure that they're entirely on board here. So, yeah, I think that's an area for regulation.
So what would that look like from your standpoint?
Some sort of registry, maybe even, nothing is, I don't know if
Nothing as effective as the current business registry?
No, nothing that effective, right? I'm thinking more of European, show your passport, register, that type of thing. So that's how we get the data for the overnight stays. But then the cost for doing that then are fees, and accompanying the fees are penalties for not cooperating with that system, in which case people that don't want to cooperate are going to face fines. So
that takes care of sort of the permitting and
Yes.
cost of the permitting.
Yeah.
What would you actually want to restrict?
What's
the end goal of the process?
I would restrict, I would be highly restrictive. I would have to study the vacancy and occupancy figures for all this new hotel space we've built. But I would not be overly generous to the B&B people till I filled up the hotel rooms that are already taxed. And I mean, I wouldn't make it easier for people to go to a different system, a contract system like that with individual subcontractors with no fees to compete with these hotels that haven't we just assessed them an extra 15% or something for
But are you saying then if all the hotels are full, then it's okay with you to have?
No. I'm saying that to begin with, that's what I'd use once again, just as with housing or footage, cap, and all that, is slow it down, study it, and come up with a rational policy for dealing with it. I don't think the current approach is rational. I don't think the whole idea of the competition between contractors like Uber and Lyft in regard to medallion owners of cabs is working out that well either. But we're early in the game in a lot of this fee-for-hire type of economy. And to begin with, I would definitely want to know what's going on. And I know it's bigger than people are letting on, because I hear word of mouth when people are saying, I've got this many tenants a year now, and I'm charging this much for my cottage because it's a short walk over to Stanford, over here in Southgate type of area, or Evergreen. And that
Do you view this issue as a political hot potato?
It will be when we get the data. Yeah, it's happening. There's a lot of it happening.
Because so many people are doing it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so many people, by economic pressures, their mortgage payments and this and that, and their lifestyle. They want to go to Tuscany for a month. And, I can't go to Tuscany for a month because I can't afford to pay a place here and go there, So what used to be very doable is no longer doable, So, yeah, I think it's the wave of the future, really, that kind of economy. But we can be forward-looking, I think, and come up with some solutions.
Okay. Another conflict that's arisen multiple times over the last couple of years has to do with architecture and the architecture of certain buildings, particularly downtown. There have been a number of appeals of projects that at a lower level had received a recommendation. 429 University, for example, the Elizabeth
Yes,
Wall
Shady
building.
Lane.
Yeah, Shady Lane. Objectively, it fits within the guidelines, but subjectively, there's some questions, and it's been appealed a couple times. I think the question is, how do you approach these kinds of projects that, on the one hand, seem to fit all the rules? On the other hand, it upsets neighbors, people who want.
Well, I think there's a problem with the interpretation of the rules, and one of the reasons I suggested demoting the Architectural Review Board to an advisory rather than a procedural hurdle, the quasi-judicial stuff that the governance says. I read the charge for the ARB: promote orderly and harmonious development, enhance the desirability of residence or investment, encourage the most desirable use of land and improvements, enhance living conditions, and promote visual environments of high aesthetic quality and variety. I don't think they've accomplished their charge. And so I would rather have them as an advisory rather than being totally instrumental to the design process and a court of last resort in a problem when the neighbors complain. I thought the place 437 Lytton was not in compliance with the neighborhood aesthetic, and I thought the historic review of the street itself, a substandard street, a 29-foot street, it was made that problem on Lytton the same problem as on Shady Lane. You can't have these residents, historic Victorians and so on and so forth, in an area where they're going to be dominated by a building like they wanted, as the one they sought to build at 411 and the one that they want to build at Shady Lane there. And so I think the city it's entirely within the parameters of their planning guidelines to create higher impediments, to not stamp it, get it to the Architectural Review Board, and have them be a backstop for a problem that does not comply with some of these harmonious development, desirable use, and all these other issues.
So would you be shifting the responsibility for compliance with those charges to the staff?
To the Planning Commission first, in a non quasi-judicial sense, the Planning Commission, the hearings and stuff like that, so that you would have to vet a project like that with both the Planning Commission and within the Planning Department. And the problem I find with the Planning Department is also and community environment. I do not think the Planning Department is fulfilling its charge into protecting the community environment. And then if you look at the flow chart here, and this is my argument about the trees, you've got the environmental compliance, and this involves tree cutting in public works. It's not even under the community environment. And so you go, wait a minute, because I ran around that mulberry bush when they were cutting down that big redwood in my neighborhood. And by the time I could suss it out, they had the crew out there. Somebody ratted me out, and they had the crew out there the next week cutting the tree down. Because I couldn't work the deal between, if I'd been a lawyer, I would have slapped an injunction on them, but I don't operate, I'm a school teacher, pussycat. But I couldn't believe it, how fast that happened. But once I found out it was another department and what hoops I had to jump through, it took me 2 days to do that, and the next Monday the crew was out there and cut it down. And it got all chipped. None of it was saved as lumber. Could have built a nice house out of a tree, that 80-year-old redwood, multi-trunk redwood. I mean, nice garage at least to live in,
Shifting gears, the downtown residential parking program, what lessons have been learned from that in your judgment? Is it working the way you would like to see it work? And how will you apply what we've learned there to Evergreen Park in the California Avenue area?
And stretching up towards Chaucer now, if I understand the people in that part of town, I think we should have been more alert at the beginning, the ripple effect of throwing the pebble in the pond. also, I think there is an equity issue. I had one of the residents who rents in that part of town go off on me, and I'm fairly radical, at least in the past. When I was younger, I was. And he said, what is it with these people that claim to own the land and now they claim to own the streets? And he went off on me. And I went, whoa, this is and he had one car, he and they were students, I think, at Stanford and all that. And I said, well, yes, there probably are equity issues here, but can't we work this out with the employers, the employees, and the residents? Isn't there a way to get, as many cars as we can onto the landowner's property and then have the differential between what the people are paying? I think there's a problem there with if you can get 3 permits at $50 and then a month, so the homeowner, who is a rate paying taxpayer after all. I mean, that's why they should be cut I had to explain that to the guy, why they should be cut the slack. But I think all of those forces need to be each party needs, I don't want to use the jargon about stakeholders and this and that. Each party needs to negotiate a common solution, but the main thing is part of the problem was built by the government by allowing underpark structures and by creating no process back when there was fewer demands before the big tech boom came. Office space, an office this big had 1 or 2 people in it. An office this big can have 6 to 8 people in it nowadays. And that's a problem.
So getting back to the RPP.
Yeah.
Is it working now to your satisfaction, or do you want changes made?
I think the adjustments need to be made to both the rate that people pay, the amount that the tax rate paying property owners pay for their permits, and the ability or the necessity of employers to cover the parking fees for some of their employees. So I would address the problem at the rate level, I think, not at the general scheme. The general scheme I kind of like. I like where things are going, I think.
So what do you think is too cheap or too expensive?
Well, I think multiple permits for people that have a lot in which they can park cars. What is it, 3 permits they're allowed, guest permits, if they own a property?
Something like that.
Yeah. So I don't think there's an incentive there to park cars on their property. There's an incentive to, if not park cars on the street, to keep places open for guests and stuff like that, which is understandable too if guests come to visit. So that's what I would like to see. I think that's the thing that couple was going off on me on over there on the edge of Professorville.
So you think we're being too generous to the residents in terms of the availability of on-street permits? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, without making it so the employees, now raising wages is a step to help those employees out. But the reason there's so many help wanted signs by people at a certain pay rate is they can't pay for the parking. They start looking for a job closer to home and they change jobs.
But doesn't that just put pressure on the employers to make sure that they provide that
That's right.
parking
And I'm
benefit
willing
in
to
some
put
way?
some pressure on the employers.
I mean, that's inevitably what's happened
Yes.
as a result
Yeah.
of this.
Yeah.
And so would you change anything about that basic plan other than tweaking the dollars involved when one gets implemented here for Evergreen Park and
I'm
Company
not
Avenue?
privy to the latest part of the traffic management program downtown about how many unparked places there are in those garages and stuff like that. I know it varies greatly, but for the person that's coming to work an 8-hour shift, those are the people that are mostly parked in the neighborhoods. And when I lived over on Everett Street, that was already the case in the 1980s, and it was the case when I lived on Homer Street. So, and those were all 2-hour zones.
Okay, but I'm asking you now about California
Yeah.
Avenue, and I'm wondering whether
Here.
you're going to apply the same principle as downtown.
Oh, with Evergreen and
with Evergreen Park
yeah,
and this
Southgate.
immediate area, or look towards the College Terrace model, which prohibits anybody other than residents with permits from parking in the area.
No, I think we're gonna have to go more towards the downtown model in this neighborhood.
The shared
Yes,
model.
yes, because I think that's, because of things that have been done historically in College Terrace, that's sui generis, that's a different, with the way the bumps and the street closings and all that has evolved over, I lived in College Terrace back in the 90s, so I'd say, no, more like downtown, not College Terrace.
I want to ask you really specifically about Buena Vista Mobile Home Park. Do you support spending public funds for the preservation of that mobile home park? Or do you see city funds going into a different kind of affordable
I
housing?
foresaw a different approach. I was berated, pummeled soundly around the head and shoulders by Winter Dellenbach for suggesting it. But I do think that that capital outlay by government agencies, the county and city, for $30 million, we need a redevelopment project, and we need to go upward some. And I've even said I'm willing to go for eminent domain to move all the way up to El Camino if we need to. There's that easement through there between Java Juice and Jim Davies service station. I'm not sure a service station is compatible with a denser and a modern structure, but we can go to 2 and 3 stories on parts of that property and have a real long-term solution rather than putting $30 million to preserve a totally inefficient plan. And as I said to Winter when I was talking to her, I think the way that the preference issue is working out in the courts is going to allow municipalities and people like the Santa Clara County Housing Authority to work with both allowing the preferences for existing tenants and the new development. And we could even get maybe not 60 units of elder housing there, but we could get some housing that we lost and that was already counted in our tally sheet for Maybell. So I would want, a partnership, the kind of thing that when Terman was built, the Housing Corporation partnered with Golden and Karst, K&G. It was a development company out of Southern California, and they got all of those units built. And I think that's a mixed market, and half of them maybe were below market rate out there. I lived there when I was still, before I got tenure, and was fully paid by the school district.
So in this case, you would suggest not 100% affordable housing, but some
Mixed
large-
market, yes. Some nice townhouses, sort of like the plan that was tried at Maybell but didn't float because they couldn't come to terms with, they could have done, 50 units, and instead of 12 houses, maybe 10 houses. They had no time to operate because of the money constraints and the way that everything, once it collapsed, it collapsed. And that's why I advocate for more federal support for housing, because without federal support, you don't have the time frame, if you run into a snag, to adjust your plan. But I think that the Buena Vista, it's twice the size of Maybell. It's got existing tenants, a phased development that, move some of the people into the glass slipper there for 6 months and build some housing and move them back, and then go on, do it in 3 phases or something like that. It's doable. I mean, the prayer we used to use in church was, give us the will to do what we have the power to do. We have the power and the finances to put a deal together. We don't have the time frame, and we don't have the will. We don't have the imagination, let's put it, the courage and imagination to put something. But I think it should be done, and I back that. And I value those people. I valued the kids as students when I taught at Gunn, and I value them as neighbors today. Some of those younger guys come by and help the older people with their yard work and stuff in my neighborhood, and they're always walking by on La Parra Street over to Briones. Nice. They're nice neighbors. They're good neighbors.
John, you've called for the removal, or at least the replacement, of City Manager Jim Keene.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty clear that if you're elected to the council, you're going to replace him regardless, because he's not going to stay much longer. What would you be looking for in a replacement for Jim Keene? And would he or she look very different from what Keene has brought to the city? I assume so, given.
Yeah, I think I would be. I would look for somebody a little younger, maybe a little closer to maybe a more balance between the public policy coursework at the university and experience in a similar job. And I know from when I was chairman of the department hiring teachers at Gunn, history teachers, social studies teachers, it's hard to find applicants in such an expensive area to want to even apply. And then as you sort through them, you find that they don't have either the coursework or experience that's needed to take on a job of this difficulty. So the job search itself would be a pretty rigorous undertaking, and I'm aware of that at the onset. But I would want somebody that's a little less of what I call one of the detriments of Keene's approach, a little less of an empire builder, a little less of a staff builder. He's got tremendous loyalty, but I don't think by his staff. But I don't think he has clear-cut enough evaluation assessment tools, and I don't think he. When I see the raises go, across the board and this and that, I'm not privy to I have here the evaluation system. It doesn't look as vigorous as the one we used to use in education, this idea. So I'd want somebody that's better as a manager of managing their own staff and assessing and evaluating their staff and setting goals for the staff and setting goals for the organization so that the labor costs don't mushroom, and so that if there is somebody that is identified as in education we call it needs to improve, the person gets the tools to improve, and then if they are not doing the job, they're evaluated as does not meet standards, inadequate, not satisfactory or whatever, and explained what, I'm an old union guy. I take these things as property rights, as due process rights. And I think you do need to inform people and use the tools of evaluation based on objectives to determining. And I think Jim Keene has put more energy into developing the capacity of the city to undertake certain things without necessarily keeping as close an eye as he needed to on things as they unfold. And so it's just as in the school district when you have a pilot project and you don't evaluate it. You have an action plan and you don't have criteria for determining whether it was successful. And then you go from pilot to implementation, and suddenly instead of one program at one school, you've got 13 programs at 13 schools, and it still hasn't been evaluated. I think some things in the city go forward with that, and with that kind of technique. And I think that's why I say both experience and what the state of the art is at policy centers like Berkeley and places like that, where these planners and management people are coming out of, and then where did they cut their teeth? What kind of community did they work in?
And which is it, you open this answer with that distinction, which is it that you think Jim Keene is?
Of what? Of
have the experience or comes out of the policy background?
I think he had the experience, and I think at the time he had, but it's just as a teacher, I did 3 fellowships after I graduated, but my coursework was in the late 70s, and by the time I quit in 2010, one of the reasons I quit is I had lost a step.
So I
think he's lost a step.
So he's too far removed now from modern day
I think
planning
so.
and
For the problems, for a fossil fuel free tomorrow, for all this other stuff. The water, I find the water thing, if you've read the stuff on the water, the number of gallons at just 14 and what it does to the water table, and then there's this big issue, the big sleeper issue is that Searsville Dam and what they're going to do with that. And when that football starts getting kicked around, that's going to have a big impact on the San Francisco Quone or whatever they call it, the way the water flows in through the downtown area here. When I lived over here on College Avenue, You know, all that water that comes down the Frenchman's Creek there goes underwater at College Terrace. We had a big crack in our foundation, and it was a rental. The water just poured in. You had to go down there and bucket it out. And of course, I paid good rent there. I paid $1,100 a month in those days. But still, there was a lot of water in the basement. And I don't think we're, especially with rising, I believe that climate distortion exists, that within, and the figures are more startling than we originally thought. Instead of three feet, you know, or 3 meters by the end of the century, 10 feet, we could have half of that by 2050 or so. And so the idea now, if the Antarctic melting and the Greenland melting are doing what they're doing, and the temperatures and currents and that, we have to, that's why I want somebody that has coursework at school in geology and biophysics or whatever. I don't even know the areas that are studying this thing though, but I read this stuff on the internet, and then I read what's going on here with the number of acre feet that was pumped out and into the storm drains. Oh, there's another issue. They came up with a storm drain fee thing. Gennady was there, and they rejiggered it so it was 60% management and wages and 40% capital improvement. And some people raised a red flag. They said, wait a minute, to sell this thing, doesn't it have to at least be 50-50? You can't, and so that kind of thing. You can't, that's a political mistake, though, I think. That's not a coursework or experience mistake.
And we're going to have to leave it at that.
Yeah, yeah.
John Fredrich, thank you very much.